In the late 12th century, the Kingdom of Navarre stood at a precarious crossroads. This small northern Iberian kingdom, centered around Pamplona, was caught between powerful rivals and shifting alliances. To the west and south loomed the ambitious Kingdom of Castile, eager to expand its frontiers. To the east lay the Kingdom of Aragon, another rival with its own territorial interests. Further south, beyond the Christian realms, the Almohad Caliphate dominated Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, posing both a threat and a potential ally in the ongoing conflicts known as the Reconquista. Navarre had endured centuries of pressure from its neighbours. Earlier kings had already lost territories like La Rioja region to Castilian expansion, and repeated invasions and treaties had forced Navarre to fight hard for its survival. By the 1190s, Navarre's independence was fragile, its borders menaced on all sides, and its leadership would be tested by an oncoming crisis. The stage was set for a pivotal moment in Navarrese history, one that would hinge on the decisions of its king during a Castilian invasion and an infamous lapse in readiness. Sancho VII, El Fuerte, a warrior. King's profile, Sancho VII, called El Fuerte, the Strong, came to the Navarrese throne in 1194. He earned his nickname for his legendary height and strength. Contemporary accounts describe him as a giant of a man, towering over his peers. Physically, he embodied the warrior king ideal, reputedly over 7 feet tall, vigorous, and fearless in battle. Sancho had a military reputation, forged in various campaigns even before he was king. In his youth, he had allied himself with his brother-in-law Richard the Lionheart of England, aiding Richard's forces in France. He led Navarrese knights in siege warfare abroad and gained fame as a bold fighter. As monarch, Sancho VII projected confidence and martial prowess. He was often seen personally leading troops and brandishing the heavy swords and lances his strength allowed him to wield. His leadership style valued courage and individual heroism. He was known to ride at the head of his cavalry and was celebrated for personal feats of arms. Later, he would be credited with a heroic charge at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. However, Sancho's military habits and leadership style also had drawbacks. He was a restless adventurer, inclined to range far beyond his kingdom in pursuit of military glory or strategic alliances. He spent considerable time away from Navarre on foreign expeditions or at distant courts, leaving the day-to-day governance and defense of his realm in the hands of deputies. He was a risk-taker and sometimes acted impulsively, trusting in his own strength and bold plans. Sancho's focus on warrior ethos sometimes came at the expense of prudent administration and careful defensive planning. The king could be enigmatic and unconventional. For instance, unlike many Christian rulers, he maintained friendly relations with Muslims at times and even sought their partnership. While these traits made Sancho VII an intriguing and renowned figure, they would also factor into the crisis that would engulf Navarre at the turn of the century. Geopolitical pressures from Castile, Aragon, and the Almohads. By the 1190s, Navarre's strategic situation was exceedingly tense. Geopolitical pressures were mounting simultaneously from multiple directions: Castile, Aragon, and the Almohad Caliphate. Each of these powers put strain on Navarre's security in different ways, creating a perfect storm that would soon break. Castile's ambitions. Castile, under King Alfonso VIII, had long coveted Navarrese lands, especially the Basque-populated provinces like Álava, Guipúzcoa, and Biscay, which lay to Navarre's west and provided access to the Bay of Biscay. Earlier in the century, Castile and Navarre had clashed over these border regions. By Alfonso VIII's reign, Castile was a dominant force in Iberia and looked to extend its territory at Navarre's expense. Tensions with Navarre were heightened after 1195, when Alfonso VIII suffered a devastating defeat by the Almohads at the Battle of Alarcos. Sancho VII had arrived late to aid Alfonso at Alarcos, straining their relations. In retaliation and out of desire for expansion, Alfonso VIII began plotting to isolate and invade Navarre. He sought to secure Castile's northern frontier and gain the valuable trade routes and fortresses Navarre controlled. By 1198, Castile was actively preparing for war against Navarre, viewing Sancho VII as both a rival and, due to Sancho's ties with the Almohads, something of a traitor to the Christian cause. Aragon's opportunism. To Navarre's east, King Peter II of Aragon also eyed Navarre's territory. Historically, Aragon and Navarre had competed for influence over smaller lordships in the Pyrenees, and Aragonese monarchs sometimes claimed parts of Navarre's lands. In the late 1190s, Aragon found common cause with Castile against Navarre. The two larger kingdoms forged an alliance to divide Navarre between them, an agreement sealed in the Treaty of Calatayud, 1198. By this secret pact, Alfonso VIII of Castile and Peter II of Aragon essentially decided how to partition Navarre if war proved successful. Towns and regions of Navarre were allocated on a map, with Castile slated to take the lion's share, including Western Navarre and the Basque provinces, and Aragon to seize some portions, especially in the eastern and southern parts of Navarre. This diplomatic collusion left Navarre dangerously isolated. Aragon's pressure was thus twofold. Militarily, Aragon could coordinate attacks from the east, and politically, Aragon's agreement with Castile meant Navarre had no powerful Christian ally to call upon for help. Sancho VII had attempted to court Aragon's friendship. Indeed, earlier in his reign, he maintained cordial relations with Aragon and even married a princess with ties to Aragonese nobility. But by 1198, those efforts failed. Aragon's king chose expansion and alliance with Castile over solidarity with Navarre, thereby tightening the vice around Sancho's kingdom. The Almohad threat and temptation. In the south of the Iberian Peninsula, the Almohad Empire represented the might of Islamic rule in Spain. The Almohad Caliphs controlled Al-Andalus and were in bitter conflict with Castile, Aragon, and other Christian states during this era of the Crusades and Reconquista. For Navarre, which did not border the Almohad territory directly, the Muslim power was a distant threat, but also a potential counterweight against Castile. King Sancho VII, ever an independent spirit, shocked many in Christendom by developing a friendly rapport with the Almohads. He saw the Almohad Caliphate as a useful ally to check Castile's aggression. In 1194 to 1195, while other Christian kings fought the Almohads, Sancho reportedly held back or even corresponded with them. After the Almohads crushed Castile at Alarcos, 1195, Sancho's stance further diverged from his Christian neighbours. He essentially made common cause with the enemy of his enemy. By 1198, Sancho VII went so far as to enter Almohad service. He led a Navarrese contingent on campaign in North Africa, or southern Iberia, under the Almohad banner, in exchange for gold and the promise of military support. This extraordinary alignment, a Christian king allying with a Muslim caliph, drew the ire of the Pope and neighbouring Christian monarchs. It gave Castile a moral pretext, in their eyes, to invade Navarre as a rogue kingdom consorting with infidels. At the same time, Sancho hoped the Almohads could pressure Castile from the south and relieve Navarre. The geopolitical reality, then, was that Navarre was squeezed between the hammer and anvil. If Sancho stood with his fellow Christian kingdoms, he risked domination by them. If he allied with the Almohads, he isolated himself and provoked Crusader hostility. He chose the latter strategy, a high-stakes gamble that would soon be put to the test. The road to crisis, strategic missteps, and rising tensions. By 1197 to 1198, all the pieces for a crisis were in motion. King Sancho VII made several fateful decisions in this period that, in hindsight, set the stage for disaster. First, Sancho committed Navarre's resources and troops abroad in pursuit of his alliance with the Almohads. In 1198, he accepted an invitation and substantial payment from the Almohad Caliph to support their campaigns against rebels in North Africa. Leaving his kingdom behind, Sancho led a force of Navarrese knights across the sea or to the far south of the Iberian Peninsula. The exact details are sparse, but chroniclers describe Sancho's presence in the lands of the Moors during these years. This prolonged absence meant that Navarre's king was physically removed from his realm at a critical time. Sancho trusted that a bold stroke, getting the Almohads to threaten Castile, would secure Navarre's safety while he was away. It was a strategic gambit. If the Almohads attacked Castile in force, Alfonso VIII would have to abandon any plans against Navarre and rush south to defend his own lands. Confident in this plan, Sancho essentially bet his kingdom's security on diplomatic negotiations with the Caliph. Meanwhile, Castile and Aragon took concrete steps towards invasion. In May 1198, as mentioned, Alfonso VIII and Peter II formalized their pact in the Treaty of Calatayud, openly agreeing to cooperate against Navarre. Almost immediately after, Castile began military preparations. Castilian troops occupied some disputed border fortresses, e.g., Castile seized the town of Miranda de Ebro around that time, nibbling at Navarre's frontier. Castile also secured the loyalty of important nobles in the region. Notably, Diego López de Haro, the powerful Lord of Biscay, joined Alfonso VIII's cause. The House of Haro had once been Navarre's vassals. By 1200, they were leading Castile's vanguard into Navarre. Castilian armies mustered in the north, and fleets readied to patrol the Cantabrian coast to cut off any Navarre's reinforcements. Aragon, for its part, posed a threat from the southeast. Although Peter II was initially occupied elsewhere, his mere alliance with Castile forced Navarre to consider a two-front war. In essence, by 1199, Navarre was encircled. Castile's forces massed on the western border, and Aragon's stance was hostile in the east. Sancho VII's own kingdom, in his absence, tried to prepare defensively. Sancho had left Navarre under the nominal care of his officials, possibly the Bishop of Pamplona, Garcia Fernandez, and various local lords. But without the king's leadership, coordination was lacking. The Navarrese hurriedly fortified key towns such as Vitoria, a fortress city founded by Sancho's father in Álava, and the strongpoints along the mountain passes. However, Sancho's absence meant there was no central command to rally all nobles and soldiers. Some Navarrese nobles were demoralized or even in secret contact with Castile, seeing the writing on the wall. Financially, Navarre scrambled to raise funds for mercenaries and supplies. Records suggest Sancho VII even mortgaged royal property, such as the royal palace, to finance defense, a sign of desperation. Still, without the king present, many defensive measures were piecemeal. Communications with Sancho were slow. Letters or messengers had to travel weeks to reach him abroad. So the kingdom was essentially on its own for immediate decisions. As 1199 dawned, the atmosphere in Navarre was anxious. Rumors flew that Castile would invade any moment. Villages and towns along the border braced themselves, while the kingdom's leadership hoped against hope that Sancho's gambit would pay off in time. Castile invades Navarre, 1199, the siege of Vitoria and the fall of the Basque provinces. In the summer of 1199, Castile struck. King Alfonso VIII launched a full-scale invasion of Navarre's western territories, focusing on the rich and strategically vital Basque provinces of Álava and Guipúzcoa. The Castilian army, led by Alfonso himself and marshaled by experienced commanders like Diego López de Haro, crossed into Navarrese lands with little initial resistance. Town after town was caught off guard by the swiftness of the attack. Álava, the province closest to Castile, was invaded first. Castilian forces quickly overran rural strongholds and isolated castles. Many local lords in Álava, feeling abandoned by their king's absence, chose not to resist fiercely. Some even surrendered through pact. Notably, Guipúzcoa, to the north along the coast, largely fell without pitched battles. The urban elites of Guipúzcoa's towns, including the important port of San Sebastián, negotiated terms with Alfonso VIII, effectively switching allegiance to Castile in exchange for guarantees of their regional laws and privileges. This relatively bloodless capitulation was a blow to Navarre. It showed that loyalties were fragile when the king could not defend his vassals. Within months, Castile controlled most of Guipúzcoa and western Álava, encountering only scattered resistance. The main stand organized by Navarrese forces took place at the fortress city of Vitoria. Vitoria, called Nova Victoria when founded, was a key Navarrese outpost in Álava, commanded by a loyal knight named Martín Tipia, as the Royal Castellan. As the Castilian army advanced, Martín Tipia and the inhabitants of Vitoria shut their gates and prepared for a siege, determined to hold out for their king. In June 1199, Alfonso VIII's troops surrounded Vitoria, initiating a siege that would become the focal point of the war. The Castilian besiegers employed all the methods of medieval siegecraft. They set up encircling camps, constructed siege engines, and launched repeated assaults on the walls. Vitoria's defenders fought back fiercely. Contemporary accounts speak of a great shedding of blood in the initial assaults as the Navarrese repelled Castilian attacks using arrows, stones, and sorties from the gates. Alfonso VIII, found Vitoria to be a tougher nut to crack than expected. Rather than lose more men in costly direct assaults, the Castilian king opted for a strategy of attrition. He settled in for a long siege, blockading the city to starve it out. By cutting off supplies of food and water to Vitoria, the invaders sought to force a surrender over time. As summer turned to autumn 1199, the siege of Vitoria dragged on. Inside the walls, food stocks dwindled and the situation grew dire. Yet the Navarrese garrison still refused to capitulate. They were holding out hoping for relief, a relief that, tragically, would never come. Meanwhile, across the rest of Navarre's western regions, Castile consolidated control. Castilian troops occupied the Duranguesado, eastern Biscay, and the remaining parts of Álava not yet taken. Fortresses that resisted were isolated once Vitoria was surrounded. Essentially, by late 1199, much of Navarre's breadbasket and access to the sea had been severed. The kingdom's western half was either occupied or under siege. During this critical period, King Sancho VII was nowhere on the battlefield. He remained far to the south, likely in Morocco or southern Spain, pursuing his diplomatic mission with the Almohads. Sancho expected that the Almohad ruler would, at his urging, launch an attack into Castile that would compel Alfonso VIII to lift the siege and rush to defend his own realm. Unfortunately for Sancho and Navarre, this plan fell apart. The Almohad Caliphate, embroiled in internal divisions and rebellions, failed to mount any northern offensive in time. Sancho's negotiations dragged on fruitlessly. The promised relief from the Muslim forces did not materialize. Castile was therefore free to continue its war in Navarre without fear of a Moorish counterstroke. Sancho's absence became increasingly damaging as weeks turned to months. He had effectively bet his kingdom's fate on a second front that never opened. The chain of military decisions, Sancho leaving Navarre to seek help, Castile deciding to invade while he was gone, had led to an unfolding catastrophe. Communication breakdowns, a kingdom cut off from its king. One of the most striking aspects of the 1199 to 1200 invasion was the complete breakdown of communications between King Sancho VII and his besieged kingdom. As the siege of Vitoria wore on, Navarrese officials desperately tried to reach their absent monarch. Messengers had been dispatched when the invasion first began, but getting word to Sancho was an arduous task. The king was hundreds of kilometers away, likely beyond even the Strait of Gibraltar in North Africa. War and winter seas made travel slow. It took weeks, perhaps months, for news of Castile's onslaught to finally reach Sancho VII's ears. By the time Sancho learned of the dire situation back home, much of Navarre was already lost or in peril. In late 1199, with Vitoria still holding but starving, the defenders and Navarre's Regency Council decided on a last-ditch effort. Send a high-ranking envoy directly to find the king and plead for instructions or aid. The man who undertook this mission was Bishop Garcia Fernandez of Pamplona, the kingdom's top churchman and an influential figure. Braving the journey through enemy lines, the Bishop of Pamplona slipped out of Navarre, possibly under the safe conduct of a temporary truce, accompanied by a small party that included a knight from Vitoria's garrison. Their destination was wherever King Sancho might be, a daunting quest with sketchy information. This envoy group travelled south, crossing into Almohad-controlled territory in search of Sancho VII. The sheer fact that a bishop had to traverse foreign lands to locate his king underscores how isolated Navarre's leadership had become. After a long search, Bishop Garcia Fernandez finally located King Sancho VII in early 1200. Sancho was indeed still in Almohad lands, at the court or encampment of the Muslim leaders, and had not yet begun any return. The bishop delivered a blunt, heartbreaking message. Vitoria was at the brink of falling, and the entire kingdom's defences had collapsed. He described the unsustainable situation. Vitoria's people were starving. Castile now controlled Álava and Guipúzcoa entirely, and no Navarrese army remained to expel the invaders. Essentially, Navarre had already lost much of the kingdom, and the remaining holdouts could not endure without immediate royal intervention. The bishop likely urged Sancho to rush home with whatever forces he had. Failing that, he sought the king's authorization to negotiate surrender, to save the lives of the people in Vitoria before it was too late. The Bath incident, a king's fateful delay. It is in this fraught encounter between the bishop and King Sancho VII that the infamous Bath incident arises in historical lore. According to later accounts, when Bishop Garcia found Sancho and relayed the desperate news, the king's response was shockingly nonchalant. Sancho VII chose to finish taking a bath rather than immediately don his armor and depart to relieve his besieged city. As the story goes, messengers implored him that every moment mattered, that his kingdom was literally falling apart. Yet Sancho, whether out of disbelief, denial, or a misguided sense of personal composure, insisted on completing his bathing routine before taking action. This anecdote of a king bathing while his kingdom crumbled has been passed down as a symbol of fatal complacency. In analyzing this incident, it's important to maintain a straightforward, factual tone. Did Sancho VII truly lose Navarre because he took a bath? The reality is likely more complex, but the tale captures a genuine lapse in urgency. Sancho did delay his response at a crucial juncture. Rather than mounting his horse at once and racing for Navarre, he lingered. Some historians speculate that Sancho was physically unprepared to travel. Perhaps he was recovering from illness or wounds, hence the bath to soothe himself. While others suggest it was a moment of indecision, the king might have realized that even if he left immediately, he could not save Vitoria in time. Regardless of the exact cause, the outcome was the same. Precious time was lost. Sancho's hesitation, epitomized by the bath anecdote, meant that no relief force ever set out for Vitoria. The king effectively acquiesced to the fate that had befallen his realm, only consenting to formalize what was already evident. Navarre could not win this war now. Before leaving Almohad territory, Sancho VII granted Bishop Garcia Fernandez the authority he sought. The king authorized the surrender of Vitoria and any other enclaves still resisting. It was a grim acceptance of defeat. Sancho may have hoped to negotiate a truce or salvage some terms, but militarily, he knew Castile had triumphed. With this royal consent in hand, the bishop and his companions hurried back north. The image of Sancho in the bath has thus become a lasting anecdote because it starkly illustrates the central criticism of his conduct during the crisis. He failed to act with the required urgency. While Alfonso VIII was in the field, enduring a long campaign, Sancho VII was far away and at the decisive moment, slow to respond, even when alerted. This incident did not mean Sancho cared nothing for his kingdom, but it has come to symbolize his misplaced priorities and the breakdown of leadership. In a single vignette, we see a king literally caught, washing his hands, of immediate responsibility as his nobles begged for direction. It is a cautionary tale in monarchical duty, a ruler's personal pause contributing to a national collapse of Navarre's defences and territorial losses. Armed with Sancho VII's authorization, Bishop Garcia Fernandez returned to the Castilian siege camp outside Vitoria. In January 1200, after roughly 8 months of stubborn resistance, the city of Vitoria finally surrendered to Alfonso VIII of Castile. The surrender was orchestrated in an orderly fashion. The Bishop of Pamplona and a representative of Vitoria's garrison formally presented the capitulation, no doubt invoking the King of Navarre's consent to avoid any stigma of treason among the defenders. The terms likely allowed the surviving defenders and townsfolk to keep their lives and property, but the city itself, along with all of Álava, was annexed by Castile. With the fall of Vitoria, the last major obstacle to Castilian conquest of Navarre's western provinces was removed. The collapse of Navarre's defences was now total in that region. Álava, Guipúzcoa, and the coastal district of the Duranguesado were absorbed into the Kingdom of Castile. Gaining these territories, Castile effectively cut Navarre off from the Atlantic Ocean. What had been a significant portion of Sancho VII's inheritance, including populous towns, castles, and fertile lands, was lost in one campaign. It's estimated that roughly 1/3 of Navarre's land area and a considerable share of its population went over to Castilian rule in 1199 to 1200. This was not a temporary occupation, but a permanent annexation. Although Navarre's authorities initially refused to formally recognize the loss, in later truces, Sancho did not explicitly cede the land, clinging to a legal claim. In practice, Castile consolidated its hold. King Alfonso VIII appointed loyal nobles, such as Diego López de Haro, to govern the newly acquired provinces. Castilian law and garrisons were introduced, and local nobility swore fealty to Alfonso. The Maritime Navarre The Basque provinces that had been in personal union with the Kingdom of Navarre was effectively severed forever from the Navarrese crown. For the Kingdom of Navarre, the immediate military consequences were devastating. The kingdom's western border now shrank back to the mountains just east of Pamplona. Navarre had lost key buffer zones and would henceforth directly border a much larger and now contiguous Castile. Its defensive depth was greatly reduced, with important castles and natural barriers gone. The psychological impact within Navarre was one of shock and gloom. An entire wing of the kingdom had collapsed with barely a battle in the field. It was more a swift disintegration than a heroic war. Many Navarrese subjects felt abandoned by their monarch's strategy. Some blamed Sancho VII openly for the debacle, while others blamed the overwhelming might of Castile. Regardless, Navarre in 1200 was a kingdom halved and chastened. It's worth noting that not all of Navarre was occupied. The core highlands around Pamplona and eastern Navarre up to the Pyrenees remained under Sancho's rule. Castile and Aragon did not advance to conquer Pamplona itself in this episode, perhaps because winter and logistics halted further moves, or because the Treaty of Calatayud's partition lines had been satisfied with the western annexations. In a sense, Navarre proper survived, but in a much diminished state. The collapse of the outlying provinces made further resistance futile for the time being. Navarre's nobility and clergy essentially closed ranks around what remained of their kingdom, preparing to sue for peace. Aftermath: truce, diplomacy, and long-term consequences. In the wake of the 1199 to 1200 invasion, Navarre under Sancho VII had to come to terms with its new reality. King Sancho finally returned to his kingdom around 1200 to 1201, finding a nation deeply traumatized by defeat and territorial dismemberment. The immediate step was to seek a formal truce with Castile to halt any further hostilities. After some negotiation, Sancho VII and Alfonso VIII agreed to a truce in 1207, formalized by the Treaty of Guadalajara. This pact established a 5-year peace between Castile and Navarre. Importantly, in the truce, Navarre did not explicitly renounce its lost provinces. Sancho carefully avoided a clause that would outright recognize Castile's sovereignty over Álava, Guipúzcoa, and the rest. However, everyone understood that those regions were in Castilian hands for good. Over the ensuing years, Castile steadily integrated the conquered provinces, and Navarre, lacking the power to change the situation, tacitly acquiesced. The once larger Kingdom of Navarre was now effectively confined to its Pamplona heartland and some trans-Pyrenean holdings in what is now southwestern France. The leadership repercussions for Sancho VII were significant. His credibility had been undermined by the failure to defend the kingdom. For a time, relations between Sancho and his nobles were strained. He had to work to re-establish trust and authority. To his credit, Sancho did not give in to despair. In the years after the invasion, he focused on fortifying what remained of Navarre and improving its administration. Recognizing that Navarre could no longer rely on military might alone, Sancho turned inward. He strengthened domestic governance, granted numerous town charters, fueros, to bolster the economy and loyalty of his subjects, and amassed a considerable treasury, ironically aided by the wealth he had gained from his Almohad service. These efforts earned him a reputation as a surprisingly good administrator, trying to compensate for the loss by improving life within the shrunken kingdom. Still, the sting of lost territory never left Sancho's reign. One immediate geopolitical outcome was Navarre's changed relationship with its neighbours. Castile, having taken Navarre's western provinces, now possessed a direct border with what was left of Navarre. This inevitably led to a persistent power imbalance. Navarre had to be cautious and defensive henceforth, always aware that Castile might one day try to absorb the rest. Tensions with Castile remained, but open conflict did not resume in Sancho's lifetime after the truce. Both kingdoms turned their attention to other matters, most notably the looming confrontation with the Almohads in the south. Meanwhile, Aragon and Navarre patched up their relations relatively quickly. In 1208, Sancho VII met with Peter II of Aragon at Monteagudo and struck a mutual aid agreement, effectively ending hostilities with Aragon. It seems the shock of Castile's triumph made Aragon and Navarre realize they had more to gain by cooperation than enmity, especially as Aragon had not actually gained much in 1200. Castile kept most of the spoils. Later, in 1231, Sancho even went so far as to sign a treaty with Aragon's King James I to make each other heirs, a plan that ultimately failed due to external opposition. These moves show Navarre's strategic pivot. Having lost much to Castile, Navarre oriented itself more towards alliance with Aragon and ties across the Pyrenees. For the Almohads, the outcome was a mixed bag. On one hand, their ally Sancho was weakened, which may have disappointed them. On the other, the Christian kings soon refocused on the Muslim threat. In 1212, only a dozen years after Navarre's collapse in the west, an ironic scene unfolded. King Sancho VII of Navarre joined forces with King Alfonso VIII of Castile, the very man who had taken his provinces, to fight the Almohad Caliphate at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. At that monumental battle, Sancho VII redeemed some of his reputation. He led a courageous assault that breached the defences of the Almohad camp, and Navarre's troops helped clinch a decisive victory for the Christians. This victory was sweet revenge against the Almohads, and also somewhat rehabilitated Sancho's standing among his Christian peers. However, it did not reverse Navarre's territorial losses. Those were permanent. Navarre fought at Las Navas as a smaller kingdom, essentially a junior partner to Castile and Aragon in the crusading alliance. The long-term consequences of the 1199 to 1200 invasion for Navarre were profound. Losing Álava, Guipúzcoa, and related districts meant Navarre was now landlocked on the Iberian Peninsula, with no access to the sea and a much reduced economic base. The kingdom became more homogeneous and centered around the Pamplona-Tudela axis. Over the next centuries, Navarre would focus northward, strengthening connections with French territories. Indeed, after Sancho VII died in 1234, with no heirs, the Navarrese crown passed to the Champagne dynasty from France, a move largely motivated by a need to find a protector outside Castile's shadow. The loss in 1200 can thus be seen as a turning point that pushed Navarre into a French orbit for generations. Culturally and politically, Navarre's identity had to adjust from a Basque-Spanish dual outlook to a more exclusively Navarrese and later Franco-Navarrese orientation, since its Basque coastal provinces were now part of Castile. For Castile, the acquisition of Navarre's western lands proved highly significant. It secured Castile's route to the Atlantic, allowing it to develop ports like San Sebastian and access the sea trade. The Basque provinces would go on to be loyal and integral parts of the Crown of Castile and later Spain, famed for their fuero laws and maritime skills. The partition of Navarre, envisioned in 1198, was half realized. Castile got its share, though Aragon never obtained territory in Navarre. Eventually, Navarre's remaining independent portion survived until 1512, when Castile, under Ferdinand the Catholic, invaded and annexed it as well, uniting all of Iberian Navarre under the Spanish crown. In a sense, the events of 1200 were a harbinger of that final union. They demonstrated Navarre's vulnerability and gave Castile a taste of incorporating Navarrese lands. Conclusion. Legacy of Sancho VII's choices. In retrospect, the episode of King Sancho VII's failure to act in 1199 to 1200 stands as a dramatic lesson in leadership and timing. A convergence of strategic miscalculations and personal lapses led to one of the most consequential territorial losses in medieval Iberia. Sancho VII's choice to prioritize a distant alliance, and yes, even something as mundane as a bath, over the immediate defense of his realm proved disastrous. The collapse of much of his kingdom was the price. Navarre emerged from the crisis a smaller and more vulnerable state, setting the course of its future toward external unions and eventual absorption. Sancho VII would reign for many years after the invasion, and he achieved certain successes, notably his valor at Las Navas de Tolosa and internal reforms, but he could never undo the loss of the Basque provinces. That territorial amputation defined Navarre's fate and is remembered to this day. The anecdote of the king in the bath endures in popular history, not merely for its irony, but because it encapsulates the critical importance of a ruler's presence and prompt action in wartime. While one might debate the fairness of blaming the entire collapse on that single moment, it is undeniable that leadership can turn the tide of events, or fail to do so. In Sancho's case, his leadership at the crucial hour was found wanting. In a broader context, the story of Sancho VII and the Castilian invasion is a sober reminder of how geostrategic pressures can overwhelm even a proud kingdom when allies are few and leadership falters. Navarre's plight in 1200 was the result of being caught between greater powers and the missteps of its king in navigating those dangers. It marks the end of an era in which Navarre could claim equal standing with Castile or Aragon. After 1200, Navarre had to find a new path to survive. The kingdom did survive for a few more centuries, often by aligning with foreign dynasties. But the legacy of Sancho's reign was forever colored by the loss suffered during the Castilian invasion. Strictly speaking, King Sancho VII's decision to take a bath instead of preparing for war did not single-handedly bring down Navarre. However, it has become a powerful symbol of his failure to rise to the occasion. That image, a monarch in a moment of private respite as disaster unfolds, prompts reflection on duty and responsibility. In military history, timing and resolve are often decisive. Navarre in 1199 needed its king on the ramparts. Instead, he was absent and delayed. Thus, the fall of Navarre's frontier provinces can be traced to a combination of overwhelming external force and a critical leadership vacuum when it mattered most. The tale of Sancho VII and the Castilian invasion remains a cautionary chapter in medieval history, illustrating how even a strong king, if misdirected or untimely in action, can lose almost everything.